computer. Can everyone see the PowerPoint okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So for this week, we'll be looking at the lymphatic system. And then, so today's Monday, we'll be looking at the lymphatic system. And then on Wednesday, we'll be looking at the immune system. So I usually have one as a video and one has an in-person, but since I missed so much last week, I can do both as in-person unless you prefer the one in-person and one online. So you can go ahead and put into the chat whether you would prefer both sessions in person or keep the one video session. Okay, so you can have both as synchronous sessions or one as a video session. In person, okay. All right, so I will hold both of this week's session in person rather than having you do a video since I did so much of it last week, okay? All right, so that's that. Yeah, go ahead.
Does that mean we're gonna have in-person class on Wednesday?
Not in person, but asynchronously, unless you want in person.
No, I thought you were saying like we would go into class.
No, I'm sorry, I meant synchronous or asynchronous.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I know it sucks to drive there. I completely hear you. So we will have both sessions synchronously. So we'll meet together at 6 Monday and Wednesday. Okay. So this week, it's both chapters are relatively light anyways. It's very interesting. So the lymphatic system and today we're going to cover the lymphatic system and the lymphoid organs and tissues. The lymphatic system essentially has three main functions, okay? It's going to absorb large molecules. Think of as when we get into the digestive system, we're going to learn about how in your small intestine, there are blood vessels as well as lacteals. So the blood vessels are responsible for absorbing like nutrients, the majority of the nutrients except for fats, for lipids. And that's because your lacteals will be responsible for absorbing the fats. And your lacteals is an example of a lymph vessel, okay? Another function is that it's for immunity, okay? So it provides the basic pathway for immune cells to travel. So mind you, immune cells also travel the bloodstream, but it will also travel the lymph organs as well. And you also have specific lymph organs like the spleen, the thymus, the tonsils, the nodes, and other lymphatic tissues overall that are stationary, but you also have, which we'll talk about on Wednesday, you'll have the white blood cells that can actually circulate through the bloodstream. Okay? So the lymph also acts as kind of a protection against infection and pathogens. So let's go back to what the lymphatic system is. So the lymphatic system essentially is a network of blood vessels, of lymph vessels that allow for drainage. And eventually it does connect to the blood vessel and will drain into the blood vessel, okay? You have the lymph, which is anytime you have interstitial fluid that enters into the lymphatic system is referred to as lymph, okay? When we get to the digestive system, as well as the urinary system and the respiratory system, it may be the same fluid, but depending where it is, it goes by a different name, okay? So for example, when you learn about, when we get to the urinary system, we're gonna learn the same substance that if it's found in blood vessel, it's called plasma. If it's found in the nephron, it's called filtrate. If it's found in the collecting duct or onward, it's called urine. It's the same substance, but it's called different depending on where it's located. So same thing, it's the same substance, but if it's found in the lymph vessels, it's referred to as lymph, okay? So you have the lymphatic vessels, and then the fluid inside the lymphatic vessels is referred to as lymph, okay? And it's your lymph vessels circulate about 3 liters of interstitial fluid per day. That's not as much as your urinary system, but that's still a large amount, okay? And then connected to the lymph vessels, you'll find the lymph nodes, and they're responsible for cleaning the lymph fluid. Does anyone know how they're able to do that? What kind of characteristics would the lymph nodes have that allow them to clean? The screen a little bit smaller so I can see chat. Someone prefers to type instead of speak. So think about what kind of characteristics um, would lymph nodes have that allow them to clean the lymph. Okay, so think back to the first component of anatomy and physiology where you learned about the different types of tissues and the different types of fibers. What kind of fibers did you learn about that were really good at catching things? That forms kind of like a mesh. Okay, I'll give you options. So amongst the different types of fibers that you learned about collagen fibers, reticular fibers, and elastic fibers. Which one of those three do you think makes up the lymph nodes?
Would it be reticular?
Absolutely. And the reason for that is that the reticular fibers, they have these proteins connected to them that make them really sticky, and they're able to kind of catch the things that shouldn't be in your lymph fluid. Okay, so that's how the lymph nodes, which are consistent of the reticular fibers, are able to clean the lymph fluid. Okay, thank you. All right. So we talked about what the function of the lymphatic system overall does. It provides a kind of a surveillance, that's your protection. You have cells that phagocytosings that move around between the blood tissue as well as the lymph tissue itself. And you also have some stationary lymph tissue, such as the spleen, the thymus, the tonsils, the lymph nodes, and other lymph tissues. Okay, so that's one main function. The other function is that it's able to absorb the molecules that you need for your body. And an example of that is the fats in your large intestine through the lymph vessel called lacteals. All right. So the lymph vessel offers a one-way system. Let me show you the picture of it. So here you can see that it's a one-way path. So it goes in one direction. It doesn't go backwards. That circulates through your body until it reaches the point where it will dump the fluid, the lymph, into your blood vessel. So it's a one-way system. The lymph vessels include the lymphatic capillaries as well as the vessels. So we'll talk about the two main structures of the lymph tissue. So you've got the lymphatic capillaries and the lymphatic vessels. Starting with the lymphatic capillaries, again, same thing. They're dead-end vessels. In other words, they move in one direction and then they connect with either the blood vessel or the tissue cells, and that's it. Okay. You will find lymph vessels throughout your body except for the following structures: the bones, the teeth, and bone marrow. And until very recently, we used to add the central nervous system to that, but until very recently, we found that there are certain parts of the meninges where it does contain the lymphatic capillaries that allow for the drainage between the interstitial fluid and the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. So lymphatic capillaries are very similar to the blood capillaries that you learned about, right? So they're very thin, they're single layer, and the main difference between the blood capillaries that you learned about and the lymphatic capillaries is that they're more permeable, okay? And they can take larger molecules. And again, the same thing, right? The example of that is of how the lacteals, which are the the lymphatic capillaries can pick up the fats. Okay, so once the fats enter into the lacteals, they're called chyli. Okay, let's see. Some other differences is the reason why that the lymphatic capillaries are more permeable than the blood capillaries is because what you'll find is that the endothelial cells that form the lymphatic capillaries, their ends, instead of like linking to each other and forming junctions, they actually overlap with each other. And because they overlap with each other, they form these what's called mini valves. And it looks really cool. So I'm going to show you a picture of that. Here we go. So here you can see there's one endothelial cell, there's another endothelial cell, and another, and so on. If this was a capillary, a blood capillary, you will find the ends actually kind of merging together or connected together through junctions, right? But here you can see that they don't connect to each other. As a matter of fact, they kind of fold over each other. And that flap-like mini valve allows things to enter. Oh, where's my drawing? Allows fluid and substances to enter in, but not go out. Okay? And because of these, larger things such as fats can enter in where it can't enter into the blood vessels. And that's why in your small intestine, you not only have to have the blood vessels that can absorb the nutrients, which are smaller and easier to move through the junctions of the endothelial cells there, the fats can't because the fats are larger molecules. So they have, in order to absorb them into your body and use them, you actually have to absorb them into the lacteals, which is an example of lymphatic capillaries. Okay, questions? Okay, so another thing that you should know about the lymphatic capillaries, besides the fact that the endothelial cells overlap, forming the mini valves, they're also anchored in place by the collagen filaments, and that's just to the tissue to kind of hold them in place. So you can see that if there's an increase in extracellular fluid volume, it will cause the mini valves to open further, and if there's a decrease, then the mini valves will close. Okay. An example of the lymphatic capillaries would be the lacteals. These are the ones that you find in your intestinal mucosa, and that's what allows you to absorb the fats. So here's an example of, so the heart was here. You can see the circulatory system. The blood vessels are right here. So you can see that from the heart, it becomes arteries. And then from arteries, it becomes veins, and then back to the heart. The lymphatic capillaries pretty much follow the same path, but you can see that with the lymphatic system, you have the duct, okay, which is what the fluid is dumped into. And then you have the trunk that then splits. And just remember, anytime anything splits, it's going to be referred to as a trunk. And then along the lymphatic vessel itself, you will find sporadic nodes. Okay, and remind me what the lymph nodes are supposed to do again?
Cleanse lymph.
Yes, thank you. It cleanses the lymph because it has the reticular fibers. And that's why you'll find them sporadically through the lymphatic vessels. Okay, so here you have the lymphatic vessels with their valves that allow for fluid to move in and then continue onward. And you can see that it extensively wraps around the blood capillaries. Okay, they follow the blood system pretty closely. Okay. Questions? How are we doing in terms of speed? Okay, too slow, too fast. Okay, that means the silence. I'll take silence as okay. All right, so you can see that here's an example of a a lymphatic capillary with the endothelial cells that we talked about that forms the mini valves. All right, so those were the lymphatic capillaries. So now we're going to move on to lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels are larger than the capillaries. They actually are very similar to the blood arteries and veins in that they have how many layers? So you learned this just last week. How many layers does the blood artery and veins have?
3.
Yeah. Can you name them?
The uh I want to say there's the mm, mm, endocardium.
So anytime you
No.
have the cardium in it, it refers to the heart. But you're right, it does have something endo meaning the innermost layer, right? So you're right, it has the endothelium, okay, which forms the tunica intima or tunica interna, depending on what book you look at. And then, so that's the innermost layer. Then the middle layer is called the tunica media, which is made up of the smooth muscle. And we're talking about blood vessels, okay? And then externa, you have the tunica externa or the tunica adventitia, depending again what book you're looking at. Okay, so it has these 3 layers, and the term tunics or tunica meaning layers. Okay, so the lymphatic vessel is very similar to the blood vessels in that it has those 3 layers or the 3 tunics. Okay, and overall, it's actually closest to the blood veins. Okay, so it's closest to the veins. Okay. The difference between the blood veins and the lymphatic vessels is that it will have a thinner wall and it has more internal valves. Okay? And do you remember what the importance of valves are? What were the function of valves?
So there's no backflow.
Yes, exactly. It prevents backflow. Okay. And again, that's to stress that lymphatic vessels are dead end, right? It goes in one direction and then it dumps into it essentially dumps into your blood vessels, and then that's it. Okay. So the flow of the lymph is assisted by, just like you learned in your blood vessels, right? With veins. So let's just review. Okay. With the blood vessels, what drives the movement of blood through arteries? What drives the movement of blood through arteries? What, what drives it? You'll need to know this for your exam. So type the question into the chat. What drives the movement of blood through arteries? So what drives the movement of blood through arteries? Make a guess. It's completely okay to be wrong, and that's how you learn.
Your heart contracting and pushes blood through the heart and then through your circulatory system.
Okay, so it's the pressure, right? So it's the pressure from the heart contracting, just like you said. Okay, so blood pressure is what drives it. Okay, now you learn that as the blood moves through the arteries, which is created by the contraction of the ventricle, which leads to the blood pressure pushing it through. By the time it gets to veins, what drives the movement of fluid through the movement of blood through veins? Because now, as you move further away from the heart, what happens to the pressure? Stays the same, increase or decreases?
Decreases.
It decreases. Exactly. So it decreases to the point where at this point, what has to then help move the blood from the veins back to the heart?
Isn't it like three different things?
Yes, ma'am. What are they?
One of them is skeletal muscle.
Contraction. Yep, that's one.
Yeah.
You're on a roll. Give me the other two. Or anyone else can.
Um, a respiratory pump.
Okay. So your respiratory pump. Yep. What else?
And then the sympathetic vasoconstriction
Of what?
of the well, vein, like reducing the volume of the blood in the vein.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then you have one more. More structural than physiological. The valves, right? Arteries don't have valves, but veins do. And the main reason for that, because remember, valves prevent backflow, right? So arteries don't need the valves because the blood pressure is what drives the movement of blood. But veins don't have that pressure. So they have to have valves that prevent the blood from going back after the skeletal muscle contracts or after the respiration. Okay. So similar to that, the lymphatic vessels have to rely on certain functions that allow it to move the flow of lymph. So to move the flow of lymph, very similar to that of veins, they have the internal valves. They have lots more, okay? So very similar though. So they have the valves. They also rely on skeletal muscle pump whenever your skeletal muscle contracts. Because the lymphatic vessels run along with the blood vessels, the arterial pulse, when the arteries are contracting and restricting, okay, that will actually also that will also help move the flow of the lymph because they're side by side with each other. Okay, and then lastly, the smooth muscle of the lymph vessel wall itself contracting will also help move the movement of the lymph. Okay, so altogether, the flow of lymph is assisted by the valves, the skeletal muscle contraction, the arterial pulse, because again, they're the lymphatic vessel and the blood vessel kind of run parallel to each other. And then finally, the smooth muscle within the wall, the lymph vessel itself will help move. Okay, questions? All right, so this is memorization, but you do need to memorize that there are 5 main, either single or paired lymphatic vessels, okay? Or the trunks in which they form the smaller vessels. So the lymphatic trunks, before they divide and form the smaller lymphatic vessels, include the lumbar, which there's 2 of, the right and left, the right and left bronchomediastinal, the right and left subclavian, the right and left jugular trunk, and then a single intestinal trunk. Okay, so these are the regions of the body that they receive the drainage. Okay, will receive the interstitial fluid and become lymph. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Here we go. So here you can see in the green, you have the right and left jugular trunk right here. And then you have the right and left subclavian trunk. And then below, you have the right and left bronchomediastinal trunk. Okay. Essentially, where do you think they're going to dump into? Where do you think they're going to dump into? So once they filter the lymph, they're going to dump the lymph into what? you'll find that they're closest in terms of proximity to the intersection between the internal jugular veins and the right subclavian. So there's a little junction right here. Let me draw that. Zoom in. Oops. Okay. So at this junction right here, and this junction right here. So the lymph fluid, do you remember we said it was a dead end, right? Because as it flows, as it collects interstitial fluid into the lymph vessel and becomes lymph, it's going to move through all the nodes, get cleaned, and once it gets cleaned, it's going to dump it into this junction right here between your internal jugular vein and your right subclavian vein. Do you see that? The right side will dump into the right side, the left side will dump into the left side. Okay. Zoom back out. So again, you have 4 pairs and 1 single. You have the right jugular trunks. You have the jugular trunks. You have the subclavian trunks. You have the bronchomediastinal trunks. And then you have, that's 3. You have the lumbar trunks. And then you have 1 intestinal trunk. Okay. All right. Go back here. All right. So those are the pairs, the 4 pairs and the single lymphatic trunks that you need to know. Okay. Now, in addition to the lymphatic trunks, you also have lymphatic ducts. Okay. So the lymph is delivered from the trunks into one of these 2 large lymphatic ducts. Okay. So you have the right lymphatic duct, which drains the right upper arm and the right side of the head and thorax. And then you have the thoracic duct, which will then receive the rest of the lymph. Okay. Now, let's see a picture of that again. So the right side goes to that junction between the internal jugular veins and the right subclavian vein. But you do have a duct down here that then will essentially where all the lower lymphatic vessels join, which is called the cisterna chyli, and that will then dump into the duct right here, the thoracic duct. Here. So each empties the lymph into the venous circulation at the junction of the internal jugular and subclavian veins. So they all dump into this portion. You have 2 ducts that will collect them and then dump them into the junction between the internal jugular and the subclavian veins. And that's what you're seeing here. Questions? All right. So here's the totality of the lymphatic system. You can see the ducts, you can see the vessels, the nodes, and so on. And you can also follow the pathway of where it is drained into. It's really interesting because you would think that the whole right side of the body would dump into the junction between the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein right here. But it turns out that only whatever is shaded in green, the lymph vessels that shaded in green gets dumped into that junction right here. Where on the left side, where the thoracic duct is, will eventually dump into the left side junction between the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein. Okay, will receive the lymph from all of this side. So through the thoracic duct. So the only thing that goes to the lymphatic duct is the right side of the upper body. Okay, so what happens if somewhere along the way the blood vessel becomes obstructed. If the blood vessel becomes obstructed, what can end up is a condition called lymphedema. Okay, so that's localized swelling. Examples of what can lead to this condition is if the nodes or if the vessel is being blocked, oftentimes it's usually a tumor that's doing that. And then if you remove that that blockage area, then it will improve the pathway, and then the flow would come back. All right, so that's the lymph vessel and lymph capillaries. Any questions before we move on to the lymph organs? Okay, so with the lymph organs, we're going to be going through the thymus. The lymph nodes we already did. Actually, we only went through the capillary, so we'll go through the lymph nodes. We'll go through the tonsils, the spleen, the appendix, and the pylorus patch. So these three right here are going to be grouped into what's called MALT, and we'll talk about that at the end. So we'll talk about the thymus, the lymph node, the spleen, and then the MALT organs. Okay. So the lymph nodes are essentially the principal secondary lymph organs. You have hundreds of these nodes. Some things you need to know about them is that where they're found, they tend to aggregate in the connective tissues where you find the lymphatic vessels. Where specifically they'll be found would be areas like the inguinal area, the axillary area, and the cervical area. Why do you think these three areas? Look at the picture. So why do you see so many of them here? Here, and here. Why these three?
Is it because it's the warmest spots?
They are moist and warm, but what else? Go back to thinking what the function of lymph nodes and all the lymphatic systems for.
Is it because like they kind of lie along like major arteries?
That's getting closer, definitely. Keep along that track. What's the purpose of lymphatic tissue?
Does it have to do with cleansing glands?
That's even closer. Yep. So what are they cleansing from? So those reticular fibers, what are they trying to catch?
Is it like they lie along the arteries so that like as like bacteria moves through those like lymph node areas, they can like catch them?
That is exactly it. You got it. Okay. So you can see that particularly the neck right here, that's connected right to your oral cavity, right? That's where you can introduce a lot of pathogens. Also in your groin area, lots of pathogens through sexual contact. Okay. And the axillary areas, because that's just a nice place where things get dumped, drainage, movement of the fluids. Okay. So you can see that particularly with the particularly with the inguinal and the cervical area, that's where you most of the time introduce foreign substance like bacteria into the body. And that's where you'll find the majority of them there. And in the axillary, because that's, your limbs are moving all the fluid to this area before it gets dumped into the bloodstream. Okay. So that's the reason why they're located where they are. Okay. So you find it in the deep connective tissues that are found along the groin, the armpit, and the neck because of that very reason. All right. I could use this picture to draw it. That's okay. Okay. So the lymph nodes, very similar to the lymph tissue that we talked about earlier, the vessel and the capillary. The nodes in particular act as the filters. Okay? And we talked about why, right? They have the reticular fibers. They're mainly made up of reticular fibers that are meant to catch things. And when they catch things, they're nearby. So in the lymph nodes, they have stationary white blood cells that act as macrophages. And these macrophages that are always found in the lymph nodes, okay, act as phagocytes. Someone remind me what phagocyte means?
It engulfs bacteria and then like destroys it that way.
Perfect. So the macrophages, which come from the monocytes, hopefully you remember that, right? So you have the 5 types of white blood cells, neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. The monocytes differentiate into macrophages. So the macrophages are stationed in the nodes that help to remove and destroy things that shouldn't be in there, particularly pathogens. Okay? And they also move debris. And they essentially prevent things that shouldn't be in your blood. They help clean your blood in a different way that the urinary system does, essentially. Okay. Now here's the problem though. Things like pathogens can get into it. Okay. But what else can enter into the lymph system? So the lymph system can actually facilitate the movement of what in a much higher degree than the blood vessels can. I mean, both are bad, but lymph is really bad. Cancer. Okay, so metastatic cancer can either spread through the bloodstream if it has access to the bloodstream and lymph. Particularly since we're at a women's college, right? What kind of cancer can spread very easily through the lymphatic system?
Breast cancer.
That is exactly it. Okay, that's the biggest fear, is that the breast cancer can easily go into the lymph vessels and spread this way, more so than it can enter into the bloodstream like other cancers can. All right, okay. So that's it's meant to protect, but it also can be dangerous if things that can, like cancer, cancerous cells can go into it and then be able to be delivered to others. But normally what it's supposed to do is that it's supposed to be your immune system. It offers a place for the lymphocytes to become activated as well as mount an attack against any non-self antigens. Okay, normally it should be non-self antigens. Unless you have an autoimmune system, which we'll talk about on Wednesday, okay? Then in which case it will attack self antigens. But the lymphocytes will become T and B cells, and the T and B cells will mount an attack against the non-self antigens. All right, so here's a dissected or cut in half lymph node for you to see. What do you notice here? Take a minute or two just to kind of look and think about it and tell me what you notice. Okay, what do you think? Are you still able to see the PowerPoint okay?
I think it just X'd out. I can't see it. Did you minimize it?
No, I moved it to my laptop just because I can use, I forgot I can use my my pen to write a little bit easier than the mouse, but that's okay. I will use the other screen instead. Okay. So what do you got? What do y'all think? What are some things you notice in this image? Okay, let me ask you questions then. In terms of flow, which is more abundant? Things flowing in, things flowing out.
Flowing in.
Yeah, exactly. So you'll notice that there's a lot more afferent lymphatic vessels that will bring the lymph into the node than there is efferent vessels that take it out. As a matter of fact, you will only find the efferent lymphatic vessels at the hilum. Remind me what the hilum is. You see this term all the time. Maybe you may not have gotten it in the first half. So the hilum is this space right here. It's not an actual structure, but it's a space that things exit. Okay. So for example, the kidney has a hilum where you'll find the blood vessels as well as the ureter moving out. Okay. So the hilum is the space right here. Okay. All right. So you can see that there's a lot more going into the node than going out. Okay. That's one major difference. Another difference that you'll find is that in the cortex, you will find the lymphoid follicle. Okay, so the lymphoid follicle is everything in that like purple right there. Okay, so the lymphoid follicle is important in doing what? That's where you'll find the activation of, the lymphocytes. All right. So that's the lymph node. Okay. All right. So some diseases that are associated with lymph node conditions would be buboes. Okay. So when the lymph node becomes swollen, tender, inflamed, essentially usually that happens when there's like too much pathogens and it overwhelms the lymph. Okay. And a condition in which a disease in which this is a symptom would be the bubonic plague. And that's why it's called the bubonic plague, because it causes buboes. And now you know it's because you see the swelling of the lymph nodes. Okay, so that's whenever you encounter a patient with bubonic plague, you'll find that their nodes are extremely swollen. Okay. Another problem could be that the lymph nodes can be overwhelmed by cancer cells. Okay. And that can also cause them to swell. Okay. So that's the lymph node. Making those noises. Okay. So that's the lymph nodes. Now we're going to move on and talk about the other lymph organs, which include the thymus, the tonsil, the spleen, the Peyer's patch, and the appendix. We're going to start with the spleen. The spleen actually has a nickname. Does anyone know what the nickname of the spleen is? What's the function of the spleen?
To filter the blood.
Yes. Okay. So you can see here's a dissected human spleen, and where is it located? So in the body, where would you find the spleen?
Isn't it upper left in the abdomen?
Exactly. So where your diaphragm is, so here's your diaphragm. The spleen is right here. So you would find your stomach down here. And then in the back, you'll find your kidneys because it's retroperitoneal. So in the front, you'll find the stomach. In the back, you'll find the kidney. And the spleen is right here. So it's in your upper left abdomen. All right. So like we said, the spleen, it functions in cleaning red blood cells. And that's what's here, cleans the blood. Not the red blood cell, it catches the damaged red blood cells. It will also catch platelets. And then there are stationary macrophages there that will help break it down. And that's why the nickname for the spleen is sometimes called the graveyard of red blood cells. Da, 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 da. It sounds so cool. I've memorized it. Okay, so but that's what the spleen does. Okay, in addition to that, it's also the site of lymphatic proliferation. Okay, so the lymph cells are going to multiply as they respond to infections, potential infections here. So it also plays a role in immune surveillance. Okay. In addition, like we said earlier, it's going to store the breakdown products of red blood cells. And in the previous chapter, you should learn about how red blood cells broken down into the hemoglobin And hemoglobin is broken down to the heme groups and the iron. And the globin chains break down into the peptides, which then are broken down into amino acids. So the spleen takes the broken down products and it moves it where it needs to go. So for example, the iron is going to make sure that is reused. The heme, the pigment, it's going to go to the liver to become bilirubin, and then biliverdin, and then processed further and then end up in feces. It's going to make sure that the peptides be broken down to amino acids and then reused as well. Okay. So that's what the first function of the spleen is. The second function of the spleen is that it's going to store the blood platelets and monocytes for when the body needs it, particularly the blood. And it can also be a site for fetal erythrocyte production. And that's less common than the first two. So you can find that the spleen has a fibrous capsule that surrounds it, just like the kidney does. And it's composed of two main types of tissue. It's got the white pulp and the red pulp. So the white pulp is responsible for storing the lymphocytes so that it can survey the blood for pathogens. Where the red pulp, that's where it functions more in the processing of red blood cells. So that's where red blood cells are broken down, the iron is stored, and platelets are stored as well. I'm not sure why it's okay. Can you hear me okay still?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so that's what we just talked about here, where you have the red pulp, okay, and then you have the white pulp. Some conditions, the spleen can get damaged, it can rupture, or it can get trauma to it, in which case you'd have to do a splenectomy. Can you survive without a spleen?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can. Because where else can a lot of dysfunction occur?
Kidneys.
Not so much as kidneys, but the
Liver.
liver. Yep. Okay. So the last lymphatic tissue that we're going to talk about is abbreviated as MALT, M-A-L-T. So maybe you've heard about, maybe not. But it stands for mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Essentially, it includes the tonsils, the Peyer's patch, and the appendix. It's really interesting because maybe like even just 50 years ago, we really didn't know the function of the mouths, the tonsils, the Peyer's patch, and the appendix. But now we've gone a long way. We finally start to see the connection between these lymphatic tissues and the function in which it has the immunity to it. Okay. So the MALT essentially is lymphatic tissue in mucous membranes, and that's the key thing is that you'll find these in mucous membranes. Okay. They protect us from pathogens trying to enter our bodies, and that's really important because mucous membranes line what? Throughout your whole body, what does mucous membranes tend to line?
Your openings.
Yeah, exactly, your openings. Okay, so that means that it's more susceptible to pathogens coming in, like all the way through your digestive tract, your reproductive tracts, your urinary tracts, all of that is exposed to the external environment, which means that those linings are lined with mucous membranes. And the mucous membranes, how they're protected is because they have lymphatic tissues in them, called these MALTs, okay? So in particular, you'll find large kind of accumulations, collections of them in the tonsil area, the Peyer's patch, and the appendix. Okay, So let's say, for example, you have strep throat. So someone tell me what strep throat is. I know you know this. One of you must have had strep throat in your lifetime.
It's an infection in your throat.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So it's an infection in your throat because it's caused by streptococcus, a bacteria that gets collected in your tonsils. And that's why with strep throat, if the swelling is too much, oftentimes they have to remove your tonsils, particularly which tonsil? Which tonsils do they tend to remove if you have swelling in your throat due to infection, like strep throat? How many of you have heard of adenoids? Okay, so that's the one that tends to be removed. Okay, but that's an example of how you find these lymphatic tissues along the mucous membranes. Okay, so they're found throughout your whole lining, but in particular, your tonsils, Peyer's patch, and appendix. So we're gonna go through each one. So your tonsils is essentially the simplest lymphatic organ. And actually before a while ago, we didn't really know what they did until more recently. But essentially you have your palatine tonsils, your lingual tonsils, your pharyngeal tonsil, and your tubal tonsils. So the one that's in your throat that catches things that you swallow are the adenoids, okay? So your pharyngeal tonsils, also known as your adenoids, are found kind of along the line of your nasal pharynx. So right after your nose and then your throat. Okay. Your palatine tonsils is on the surface of your roof. Your lingual tonsils is at the base of your tongue. Okay. So these are the three main tonsils. And then in addition to that, you do have a tubal tonsil that is at the opening of your auditory tube. So your ear. Okay. So until recently, we didn't really know what they did. And in the past, like 50 years ago, you'd automatically go in and get your tonsils removed, regardless of whether they're swollen or not. Okay? But now we know better. So we actually try to leave them in as long as possible, unless they're life-threatening and can close your breathing. Okay? They contain follicles with the germinal centers and scattered lymphoids. They're not fully encapsulated like you would find in the spleen. Okay? And as a matter of fact, in the epithelium that forms the tonsils, you will find what's called tonsillar crypts. And it's the crypts that actually trap the bacteria and then pull the white blood cells to it to break it down. So here's what it looks like. So here you have the pharyngeal tonsil, the palatine tonsil, and the lingual tonsil. Okay. So here you see the crypts right here. The space that can trap the bacteria. And then the germinal center cells that you'll find the lymphoid follicles like you did in the spleen. Okay, so those are tonsils. Moving on, we're going to talk about Peyer's patches. So the Peyer's patches are found in the small intestine. When we get to the digestive system, you'll learn that in the small intestine, they have these Peyer's patch as well as the intestinal crypts and so on. But the Peyer's patch essentially are stationary lymphoid nodules. In other words, they're stationary white blood cells that just stay there and they destroy the bacteria that is able to move its way down to your digestive tract and penetrate into your intestinal wall. Okay. Not only does it move through your digestive tract, but actually penetrate into your intestinal wall. Because there's a lot of bacteria that can do that and will do that. So you've got these pyre patches there to protect you from that. Okay. So not only do they destroy the bacteria, but they also function in producing memory lymphocytes. Okay. We're going to talk about, I'm kind of briefly going over the lymphocytes now because I'm going to talk a lot more about it on Wednesday when we talk about T cells and B cells. Okay. All right. So same thing here. You'll see that the Pyrus patches right here, they have these little space right here that will also collect and trap the bacteria. Last one is the appendix. The appendix is, so once you have the small intestine, then the small intestine, before it becomes a large intestine, there's an area called the cecum. And then the cecum, which is the last part of small intestine, has this little worm-looking structure hanging off of it. That's called the appendix. In the past, people would, do surgery, same thing, kind of remove it without really knowing what it is, because appendicitis is when it becomes inflamed with either debris or bacteria. It can rupture, and if it ruptures, it allows all that bacteria that's in your small intestine as well as your large intestine to kind of spread along your peritoneum, which is deadly. So that's why oftentimes they just kind of remove the appendix. So the appendix does contain a large number of lymphoid cell follicles as well as the other malt organs that we talked about. And they're very similar to the Pyrus patch. They're going to destroy bacteria if it's able to penetrate the intestinal wall, as well as create memory cells, which we'll later on learn are B cells that produce antibodies. And that's what memory cells are. Okay, so those were the malts. Okay, moving on to, I believe this is the last lymphatic organ that we're going to talk about, is the thymus. Okay, so the thymus is located on either sides of your trachea, right above the heart. Okay, so we had a drawing. Here's an alien, here's its trachea. So the thymus would be located like this. Two lobes. Okay, so that's why it's called bilobe. So there's two lobes on either side connected by an isthmus. Okay, it is right on top of the trachea, literally like lying on top of the trachea and then above the heart. Okay, so these function as the lymphoid organs, and the reason why the lymphocytes become T cells and B cells is because the lymphocytes go to the thymus, and that's where it will differentiate into the T cells. And that's why it's called T cells, is because it matured in the thymus, okay, which starts with a T. So the lymphocytes will go to the thymus and make all of these T cells. And that's kind of one of the main function of the thymus. It has other functions, but that's one of the main functions, okay? Interestingly, it's most active and the largest during childhood. It does shrink as you move into adolescence, and that's what atrophy means. It means it shrinks, okay? It's still, regardless of whether it's the large or the small version, it still will produce immunocompetent cells. It's just that when you become adult, it produces less. And its main function is to help the immune cells, particularly the lymphocytes, proliferate, meaning it divides and becomes T cells. And again, we'll talk more about the T cells, like the natural killer T cells and cytotoxic T cells on Wednesday. Okay. Questions on the thymus? Okay. So here's a really nice table in your book, a 19.1. It summarizes the organs But don't forget, you're still responsible for knowing the lymph vessel and the lymph capillary. So it summarizes the lymph nodes, the spleen, the malt, which includes what three things again?
Tonsils, appendix, and Kyre's patch.
Perfect. So those are the malt organs, and then the thymus. Okay. Questions? Okay. So just to kind of help prepare you a little bit more, your exam 1 will be on chapter 14, autonomic nervous system, chapter 15, endocrine, chapter 16, blood, chapter 17, heart, chapter 18, blood vessels. There will be about 40, I believe it's exactly 40, but maybe off by a few questions, but 40 multiple choice questions with 5 short answer questions. So essentially prepare to do a short answer for each chapter. It is worth 15% of your total grade in class. Please make sure to bring a number 2 pencils, as there will be kind of a Scantron sheet for you to fill out. The exam is on July 25th at 6 p.m. in Mendel 43. There's nothing after the exam, so you may go once you're done. And the resources that you'll need will be the lectures, the quizzes, and study guide. Okay. So to take just a quick survey, let me see how many students are here. So I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay, so there's 6 of you here. Five of you here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so there's 5 of you here. So not the whole class is here, but here's what I can offer for you. Okay, because kind of reviewing a little bit about the previous chapters, there were a little bit more science that I'm comfortable with. So my question for you is, would you prefer to take the exam on Tuesday or Thursday? So if you choose Tuesday, which is where we have it now, we would have lab on Thursday. Or I'm willing to switch it and have lab on Tuesday so that you can take the exam on Thursday. Is there a preference?
I'll just throw out Thursday.
Okay,
You can
so
agree either in.
I'm gonna say Tuesday.
I would also say Thursday.
Katie, Megan, do you have a preference?
You cut out towards the end for me. I just took it just went lab to Tuesday.
Okay, you were cutting in and out for me as well. So could maybe type it in the chat?
Okay.
It might be just me. Was she cutting out for all of you or just me?
Me too.
Our Wi-Fi hasn't been too good at home lately. That's probably it.
So I have 3 for Thursday and 1 for Tuesday.
I can do Thursday. I don't know if you saw that in the
I
chat.
did. I add you with so that's what brought it to 3.
And this is for when to take the exam.
Correct.
Okay.
If it was moved to Thursday, would we still get to leave as soon as we were done with the exam?
Of course.
Then maybe I'm more okay with it being on Thursday.
But we
Do you
still,
have like a
Yeah, go ahead.
time estimate for how long you think it would take us?
Students normally take about an hour to, the range is about an hour to an hour and a half. Some
Okay.
students, yeah. Some
I
students
would
take faster,
honestly
slower.
then, if that's the time frame, I would probably say Thursday too.
Okay. Katie, do you? Oh, Katie said Thursday. Sorry. Okay, I see it now. Okay. So let's move it to Thursday, and hopefully this is meant to help you, but if it stresses you out more, let me know and we'll keep it as is. Because whether we do lab on Tuesday or Thursday, it doesn't really matter to me.
Would it be possible to also, like, I see the study guides for the other exams, but they're not accessible. Since we like did the lymphatic system today, would it be possible to make that study guide accessible so we can like start filling it out as well?
Okay, absolutely. But the lymphatic is not on the exam.
Okay, it's on exam 2 though.
Yes, it is.
Okay, then
Yeah.
that would be great to see that one.
Yeah, I'll have all of them up actually. Hopefully by the end of this week.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what I have for you, and we'll still meet on Tuesday, but we'll in lab we'll do lab on Tuesday. So in lab, the models will be there. I'll also have a sheep heart. I don't think I'll have a fetal pig. Fetal pig I'll save for digestion. You are not responsible for knowing the animal structures on your practical exam, but I just want to have it there so you can touch and feel real tissue. Okay? And then on Wednesday, we'll meet online. We'll have the lecture on the immune system. And then we'll have your exam on Thursday, starting at 6 p.m. You can leave when you're done. Does that sound okay with everybody?
Yes.
Yep, I'm good with that.
All right. So I will see you tomorrow.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, do you have any questions for me?